So today's web dev tip is all about optional chaining in JavaScript, and this is a feature that was introduced in ES 2020, and it'll allow you to actually access parts of an object safely because those properties may not exist on the object that you're trying to access. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So we've got an address object in our JavaScript at the moment, and basically what's happening on the page is when it loads, we're getting the state property, which is nested in the region property of the address, and then just displaying it on the page. So that all works fine, that's no problem at all. And if that state property didn't exist on the region property, then that's not a problem. We won't get any errors, but we will get an undefined output on the page that we're looking at. The problem comes in when we're actually trying to access the nested state property when this region property doesn't exist. And you can see here we're getting no output, and if you have a look in the developer tools, you'll see that we are getting an error saying that we can't read the property state from region because region will be undefined when we try and access it on line 21 down here. So you might not think this will happen very much, but if you're retrieving data from an API or the data that you're working with is changing, or you've even got some user input, then it's likely that this will happen, and you can't always trust that the properties that you're trying to access will actually be there on the objects that you're using. So one way around this is to use the optional chaining operator, which is basically just a question mark that you put before the property that you're thinking might not exist. So in our case here, we know that region doesn't exist in our object anymore, so we're going to put a question mark after region. And it's almost like asking a question saying if this region property does exist, then carry on and we can access the state property after that. So if we save that now, you can see the error goes away in the console, but we're getting the undefined output, which is what we had before when the state property didn't exist. But at least you can see now that the JavaScript can continue and it doesn't completely fail and break the entire page. Just as a little side note, if you want to display a value rather than undefined, you can use the OR operator and then just provide a value on the end of that. And instead of getting undefined in our output, we'll now just get the value that we specified after the OR. So you can use this optional chaining as much as you like, especially if you've got a deeply nested property that you're trying to access. And this will work as well if the object that you're trying to access is itself undefined or null. So for example, if we redefine address down here and set it to null, just obviously comment this out because we can't have two consts here. You'll find if we go back to our dev tools here, you'll see we're getting a similar sort of error that we did with the state property, saying we can't access the property region of null because now the value that's stored in address is null. So we can put another optional chaining operator here after address, and if we save that, the same thing happens again. JavaScript safely allows us to query those properties without causing an error. So there's one other thing I just wanted to show you as well here. So what happens if you're trying to actually access an array item that doesn't exist? So here we can see that the line property has got an array of a couple of strings in there. So what happens if we were to do something like this, where we wanted to say line 0? So at the moment it works okay, so we get 1, 2, 3 somewhere street. But what if that line property didn't exist in the same way that the region property didn't exist? If we save that, we're back to square one where we've got our error again. So we can still use optional chaining with arrays, but the syntax is a little bit funny. So we just say we want to check whether the line property exists, but we still want to access the array if it's there. You can see I've got a little error here in VS Code, but we just put another dot after the line property. And although that looks a bit funny because you're using a dot just before an array, that is the correct syntax. Now you can see we've got our unknown output, which is our default value here. So this still works if we reinstate line. So if you need to access a property that has arrays, this is the format that you use. So that's it for the optional chaining operator in JavaScript. Stay tuned for more web dev tips.